During the Second World War, a man was arrested for calling Winston Churchill a fool. Now, quite predictably, the opposition was up in arms. He said it's a police state and so on and so forth. But Churchill retorted with a disarming smile. He said he wasn't arrested for calling the Prime Minister a fool. He was arrested for revealing a national secret at a time of war. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard of fighting fire with fire, but this was perhaps fighting humor with humor or ridicule with sarcasm and wit and innuendo. A few years ago, a legislator in Kerala had lashed out at judges, calling them idiots, sitting in glass houses, passing verdicts that have only the value of grass. And if they have any self-respect, they should resign and quit their offices. Now, I'll give you the background, the context to this. This was after the court had clamped down on demonstrations in that state. The matter went to court, and deprecating his conduct, the Supreme Court in so-and-so versus High Court of Kerala found these utterances vitriolic and slanderous, with the intention to lower the dignity of the court and to obstruct and to impede its functioning. Such incidents, and I'll come to many more contemporary ones in the course of my lecture, have reopened this debate on our contempt law vis-a-vis free speech, contempt law through the prism of free speech. We all know that a fundamental right is not merely guaranteed, not merely granted to citizens, but guaranteed to citizens. That's the difference between a fundamental right and other rights. And under Article 19(1)(a), all of us have the right to freedom of speech and expression. So if this statute, and we often hear terms like colonial relic being attributed to the Contempt of Courts Act, saying that it's a colonial hangover and so on and so forth, and that it was meant to gag dissent in the pre-independence era, or at least the mindset. By all means, in that case, let's put it on the chopping block. But we must remember that it was not the British, but the framers of our constitution who thought it fit to not just impose contempt as one of the reasonable restrictions under Article 19(2) to the fundamental right of freedom of speech and expression under Article 19(1)(a), as I told you, but also empower the Supreme Court under Articles 129 and 142(2), as well as the High Courts under Article 215, 215, to punish this act. Now, there cannot be much of an objection to civil contempt, which is defined under the statute as under Section 2B of the Contempt of Courts Act of 1971 as willful disobedience of any judgment or willful breach of an undertaking given to the court. It's the wording of criminal contempt, which, as you know, carries imprisonment of up to 6 months and a fine, that many believe seems too wide. Section 2C penalizes communication that scandalizes or tends to scandalize a court, that prejudices or interferes or tends to interfere with judicial proceedings, or obstructs or tends to obstruct the administration of justice in any manner. You see the nomenclature used here, it's pretty wide. Now, what exactly tends to scandalize or interfere with the judiciary is something that we all know could be very subjective, which is why by an amendment in 2006, there was a clause inserted. Clause B was inserted in Section 16 of the Act to allow truth as a valid defense. Just like defamation, truth is one of the valid defenses. Under Contempt of Courts Act also, they thought it fit to insert Section 13B to allow truth as a defense, as a valid defense. Now, let's remember that decades ago, the Sanyal Committee had recommended that the burden of proof of any defense should be on the alleged contemner. But there are riders in this 2006 amendment. What is that rider? The rider lies in the expression, the court may. Let me repeat that, the court may. And that confers a discretion on the judge to either allow or to refuse this defense. The court may allow it, or the court may refuse that defense. So the last word, as it were, remains with the court. So many believe that this is not much of a concession, really. This is not much of a, an attempt to take away the sting from the act, because still the discretion, the ultimate authority remains the judge who's sitting in judgment over the contempt complaint filed. Now, contempt actually earlier, good old days, usually used to be committed by journalists, much before the era of the social media. Now, talking purely about contempt by the mainstream media, as a former television journalist for 15 years, bureau chief and resident editor, I do believe that the media has a right to not just report, the media also has a right to analyze, to interpret, to investigate happenings in public interest. Because that freedom of speech and expression is not just an individual right, it extends to viewers. What the freedom of speech and expression that the media exercises extends to viewers, it extends to readers. Which is why the framers of this law thought it fit to add section 3(1) to exempt innocent publication. They thought it fit to add section 4 to protect fair and accurate reporting of judicial proceedings. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the line must be drawn so that investigation by the mainstream media, by the media, does not stray into adjudication. That is a domain of the courts and the courts alone. So this is something that has to be borne in mind by our media friends. But as I said earlier, most of the contempt today is committed not by the mainstream media, but by sections of the social media, and I'll come to that later. Now, contrary to popular belief, the goal of contempt is not really to just insulate judges from criticism, but to prevent erosion of public confidence in the administration of justice. It's not that a judgment cannot be criticized. A judgment is assailed all the time. Every time you file an appeal, you assail a judgment. So while a judgment is passed and it can be assailed, or as Jeremy Bentham so beautifully put it, it's given over to criticism. It's given over to criticism. Personal motives cannot be attributed to a judge. You may attack the judgment, but you cannot attack the judge. No personal motives. Now, how does one distinguish a personal motive from attacking the judgment? How does one make a distinction between discourtesy from scandalizing the court? The Supreme Court in that Mulgaonkar landmark case had laid down certain guidelines on what it called punitive action for contempt. The courts, the apex court felt, were to adopt a broad-shouldered approach, pretty much like the dogs bark, but the caravan will pass on. That sort of an approach to harsh criticism of their decisions. However, it said unfounded attacks on judges calculated to destroy the judicial process cannot be ignored. No unfounded attacks on judges. There's a definite no-no even in that landmark Mulgaonkar case. Now, much later, the Supreme Court in the Narmada Bachao Andolan versus Union of India decision had reaffirmed this thinking that while hypersensitivity and peevishness have just no place in judicial proceedings, vicious stultification, vulgar debunking cannot be permitted to pollute the stream of justice. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this principle of erosion of public confidence, it's a fancy term you might imagine. What exactly is this principle of erosion of public confidence? What exactly leads to public confidence taking a hit by acts of contempt? This was tested in the Arundhati Roy case, where they felt that an affidavit is also deemed publication because it's a public record. The Supreme Court held that it is no defense to say that no actual damage has been done to the judiciary and that the proceedings may drop just because it's an affidavit. And here the court, in fact, in classic prose, it laid down a beautiful proposition of law, that it punishes the archer as soon as the arrow is shot, even if it misses the target. Let me repeat that for you. It punishes the archer as soon as the arrow is shot, even if it misses the target. Justice Frankfurter of the United States Supreme Court had summed up the law of contempt against the backdrop of fair comment in his trademark, inimitable, witty fashion. He said, if men, including judges and journalists, those days before the social media, of course, were angels, there would be no problem. There would be no issue of contempt, because angelic judges would be undisturbed by extraneous influences, and angelic journalists will not seek to influence them. The power to punish for contempt of court is a safeguard not for judges as persons, but for the function which they exercise. So, if you see, there's a common thread that runs through all these decisions of our superior judiciary and of great thinkers, jurists, that there is a distinction between making an personal attack on a judge, and attacking the institution that they represent, the judiciary that we're all in a way part of. Now, I for one believe, I mean, the part of the idea of organizing a lecture is not just to give you what's there in textbooks or what's there in case law, but to give you the speaker's opinion, especially when you call a journalist turned lawyer, they expect a very opinionated, argumentative soul out there. I'm not going to disappoint you. I, for one, believe, ladies and gentlemen, that criticism need not breed contempt. Let me say that again. Criticism need not breed contempt. But what exactly is criticism is something that I will tell you. Let me give you recent examples. A tale of, I call it, I've written about it in my column as well, at the Technical Chronicle. A tale of two tweets where there was no contempt, and it augured well for free speech. Okay, this was our own Madras High Court, our former Chief Justice, Honorable Justice A.P. Sahi. This was in the case of actor Sivakumar's tweets. He had tweeted, on courts delivering justice through video conferencing, but ordering students to fearlessly go and write the NEET exam. Okay, so Madras High Court, this particular case, took what they called that broad-shouldered approach, casting aside those critical comments by, in fact, two public figures. I'll come to the second one later. This first, of course, was Surya Sivakumar's tweets. It passed an erudite 29-page order. And the court reasoned that a constitutional court need not use a sledgehammer, to deal with a statement that had merely raised a storm in a teacup. I mean, such maturity, such magnanimity, such grace really augurs well for our judiciary. And hats off to Justice A.P. Sahi, who had authored that particular judgment. I don't know how many of the critics of the judiciary even were aware that Justice A.P. Sahi, in the course of his duty, had contracted corona, had gone to a government hospital, got cured there, and returned to work after that. I mean, some of these things, it's very easy to take a politically correct stance and try and attack the judiciary and sound clever, but these are real instances that somehow are swept under the carpet by intellectuals. Now, in the other instance, this involved a former senior colleague of mine in NDTV, Rajdeep Sardesai, who remains a good friend. A quietus was given to a contempt plea moved in the Supreme Court against him. He had made some comment about Prashant Bhushan case, saying that the court had, wriggled out of embarrassment and all that. Now, this was very interesting here. You had an uncle-nephew duo. You had Attorney General Mr. K.K. Venugopal, in that case, who had opined that, because that under Section 15 of the Contempt of Courts Act, you need, consent of the Attorney General, the Centre, or the Advocate General in the state. Go ahead. I mean, while the court can take suo motu action as well, there's another procedure where you go through consent. It's like a check and a balance there. Where Mr. K.K. Venugopal, the AG, opined that Rajdeep's tweets did not undermine the majesty of the Supreme Court. He took a very mature overall picture of the tweets, examined them, and this is the opinion he gave. Supreme Court accepted it. The same way, his nephew, our Tamil Nadu Advocate General Vijay Narayanan, took a similar stance on actor Surya's statement, and therefore you found that was given a quietus, that was given a decent burial, and no further controversy. That's the kind of magnanimity that the courts can exercise, and the courts can rise above some of these critical comments made by people who may not be experts. That's really the problem with our country. Everybody is an expert. Everybody likes to comment on everything. Not just how the judiciary should function, how the batsman should have played that particular shot, how the doctor should be doing, what they should be doing with the corona in the ICU, and all kinds of things. Everybody likes to have an opinion, nothing wrong. but sometimes you have to be a little restrained in public interest at least. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the power of the Supreme Court and High Courts that flows from Articles 129 and 215 of the Constitution to punish citizens for contempt under Section 2C, criminal contempt, must ideally be sparingly used. What amounts exactly to scandalizing the court, or what is prejudicial to or interference with a judicial proceeding or an obstruction to the administration of justice is a gray area. A lot of people say they seem to lay the blame at the judge's table, buck stops there, for judicial delays. But what about lawyers who seek a lot of adjournments? What about the biggest litigant in the country, the government? So who contributes? It's collective blame, if at all. It's not just the judges who are responsible for a docket explosion or for judicial delays. There are several other relevant stakeholders there. So it has to be collective blame, if at all. Now, very interestingly, ladies and gentlemen, in 2006, that amendment which I spoke about to permit truth as a valid defense came, as I told you, with that inherent judicial discretion of the words the court may permit in Section 13B of the statute. I see some of you have joined just now, so I'm just repeating that. In 2006, there was an amendment to insert Section 13B in the Contempt of Courts Act to allow truth as a valid defense. Now, what is our motto of justice? Satyameva Jayate. You also have Yato Dharmastato Jaya in our High Courts and the Supreme Court, respectively. Does this element of discretion come across then as incongruous with our motto? This is not my view, or rather, this is not just my view. This was a question raised by the National Commission to review the working of the Constitution in 2002. Now, very often in the context of these, restrictions that are placed on free speech, we know that there are close to 9-10 reasonable restrictions under Article 19.2. If they are to be very stringently viewed and implemented, would they remain reasonable? I'm reminded of the words of Leo Tolstoy, who once said, "I sit on a man's back, choking him and forcing me to carry him, and yet assure myself and others that I am sorry for him, and I wish to lighten his burden by all possible means, except by getting off his back." So, can you have so many reasonable restrictions to free speech under Article 19.2, and can they remain reasonable? These are questions I'm throwing up to you to actually mull over. If you take a hard line on all these riders, I'm just wondering whether this fundamental right guaranteed to all of us under Article 19.1a that we so greatly cherish, whether they would be subjected to a chilling effect. Worse, would they end up being consigned to a deep freezer? These are questions many of you are law students should contemplate as you study the Constitution. Now, very interestingly, observations of the Privy Council that were quoted in a Supreme Court decision in Ashwini Kumar Ghosh versus Arvinda Bose in 1953, these are very, very instructive. And I quote from the judgment: "The path of criticism is a public way. The wrong-headed are permitted to err therein, provided that members of the public abstain from imputing improper motives to those taking part in the administration of justice and are genuinely exercising a right of criticism and not acting in malice or attempting to impair the administration of justice. Justice is not a cloistered virtue. She must be allowed to suffer the scrutiny and respect, even though outspoken comments of ordinary men. Scrutiny and respectful, though outspoken comments of ordinary men." Now, these ordinary men will wonder if things other than critical comments would scandalize the court. For instance, as I mentioned earlier, like inordinate judicial delays, like judgments reserved, for which the apex court in Anil Rai versus State of Bihar had lamented, was a stark reality. Like advocates who are officers of the court not given a fair hearing. Sometimes I wonder, instead of actually doing away with the Contempt of Courts Act, maybe we need some more legislations to infuse greater public confidence in the functioning of our courts, where, for instance, lawyers are given a fair hearing, a certain minimum fair hearing for their cases to be heard. rather than just being dismissed, in a few seconds. Imagine the litigants would have traveled far and wide to hear their cases, and finally they find their cases. It's obviously possible that the judges have read their papers before coming in, so they don't need to waste time. But sometimes, at least, they say justice should not only be done but also seem to be done. So perhaps some legislation to ensure that lawyers who represent their cases are given a certain minimum hearing before the cases are dismissed, at least. Now, what has really led to why is Contempt of Court Act still topical, still an evergreen topic today? That's because there has been, in my opinion, an upward trend when it comes to criticism, perhaps scandalizing the judiciary as well. Now, this gradual rise in content that is critical, that castigates our judiciary, stems from two or three factors. Two of these are paradoxical. The first factor, ladies and gentlemen, is that, and I'm sure all of you will agree, that the judiciary, no matter what, is still seen as a last ray of hope by the common citizens. The judiciary is that last bastion of hope. There can be no two opinions about that. Secondly, that there is a level of disappointment, of disenchantment over certain decisions and the manner of functioning of the judiciary. Why? Because it is seen, and this is a perception that has been gaining ground, a perception that is not entirely without merit, I would say, but there cannot be broad brushing. I don't think you indulge in broad brushing by one or two instances which are hyped, but by and large, people seem to believe, whether it's right or wrong, this is something for us to analyze and for you to decide after listening to this lecture and doing your own research and coming to your own conclusions. That the system is not just the judges, the system is all the players. That the system seems to favor A-listers, and the system comes down hard on dissenters in the current climate in our country. And thirdly, those are the two paradoxical factors I gave you. Thirdly, the influence and reach of the social media as a barometer of public opinion. Social media. Now, are A-listers more equal than dissenters? When I ask myself this question, there's a stark example that comes to my mind. The example of an 83-year-old Jesuit priest, Father Stan Swami, who has been still moving a court to get a straw and a sipper. I mean, he got a straw and a sipper much later in the day, but of course his bail is still pending. He had to wait for so long to get a straw and a sipper because he had Parkinson's and he could not hold a cup in his hands. He had Parkinson's among a plethora of other ailments. The prosecution then sought 3 weeks' time to respond whether he needs to give a person, an 83-year-old man, a straw and a sipper in prison. What does that say about our respect for human rights? For the record, Parkinson's figures in the list of specified disabilities as a chronic neurological condition under Clause 4A2, small 2, of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016. Even if he is kept in a dispensary in prison, does he have barrier-free access as mandated by Section 25(1)BB of the statute? These are questions that one is entitled to ask. I am not really in a position to go into the merits of the case against Father Stan Swami or other activists, but who have been charged under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. But they do call for thorough investigation. There's no doubt about that, but that's not really the point. The comparison was made between Father Stan Swami's case and another former colleague of mine, Arnab Goswami's case, Arnab Manoranjan Goswami versus State of Maharashtra 2020. You know, it was widely reported, where the Supreme Court is reported to have observed that, and I quote, if we as a constitutional court do not lay down the law and protect liberty, then who will? Constitutional courts have to protect freedom, or they will be walking down a path of destruction. We need to send a message to the high courts as well to exercise their jurisdiction to uphold personal liberty, unquote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the moot question is very pertinent observations by the Supreme Court there. But the moot question remains is whether that enforcement of fundamental rights under Article 226 or Article 32 of the Constitution before the High Courts or the Supreme Court is relatively quicker for the well-heeled compared to the poor and the relatively powerless? Is it relatively quicker for the well-heeled, for the rich and famous, compared to the poor and the relatively helpless, powerless citizens of our country? Ditto with the right against deprivation of life and liberty, except according to procedure established by law under Article 21 of the Constitution or equal protection under Article 14 of the Constitution. Now, I for one believe that threats to personal liberty do not go by a calendar of working days and vacations. This whole thing of not thank God it's Friday, but dread that it's Friday. People arresting this concept of arresting people on Friday so that they will not be able to get bail immediately. That itself, the moment somebody is summoned to a police station on a Friday, they shiver in their shoes. Okay, why is that? There's a difference between a real right and one that exists only on paper. That that distinction should lie in expeditious listing and compassionate hearing based on merit and not based on the status of the petitioners or the standing of the high-profile lawyers who represent them. I mean, that is something that we have to really ponder over. And much has been written and spoken about due process of law. You would hear this so often. In fact, the term that has become today a cliche almost, bail not jail, it was first used about 44 years ago by the erudite Justice B.R. Krishna Iyer in State of Rajasthan versus Balchand, 1977. The basic rule, and I quote from Justice Krishna Iyer's seminal verdict on the point, the basic rule may perhaps be tersely put as bail, not jail, except where there are circumstances suggestive of fleeing from justice or thwarting the course of justice or creating other trouble in the shape of repeating offenses or intimidating witnesses. This phrase, as I said, has become quite hackneyed, but does it prevail on the ground? Does it prevail on the ground? Another equally old but landmark and relevant decision that I'd like to bring to your attention. Arguably, the first public interest litigation filed in India was by the Supreme Court in Husainara Khatun versus State of Bihar, 1979. Husainara Khatun versus State of Bihar. Now, in that case, the court had lamented that under trials were treated as mere ticket numbers. Ticket numbers. And the court thundered against that backdrop. And I quote, "It is a crying shame on the judicial system which permits incarceration of men and women for such long periods of time without trial. Are expeditious trial and freedom from detention not part of human rights and basic freedoms? It is high time that the public conscience is awakened and the government as well as the judiciary begin to realize that in the dark cells of our prisons, there are large numbers of men and women who are waiting patiently, impatiently perhaps, but in vain, for justice, a commodity which is tragically beyond their reach and grasp. Law has become for them an instrument of injustice, and they are helpless and despairing victims of the callousness of the legal and judicial system." Unquote. Not my words, but the words of the Honorable Apex Court of this country. More than 4 decades on, I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to put your hands across your hearts and tell me who gets timely adjudication and who feels abdication. Who gets timely adjudication and who feels abdication? This is for you to decide. Now, there have been several high-profile contempt cases in the recent past. The Prashant Bhushan case, for instance, where Prashant Bhushan had tweeted, he had tweeted that, I quote, "Democracy," he said, "was destroyed in India without even a formal emergency." He tweeted that particularly, it marks the role of the Supreme Court, particularly the role of the last 4 Chief Justices. Then in another tweet, there was a picture of the Chief Justice sitting on a 50, he said, rides a 50 lakh motorcycle belonging to a BJP leader at Raj Bhavan, Nagpur, without a mask or a helmet, when he keeps the Supreme Court in lockdown mode, denying citizens their fundamental right to justice. This was what Prashant Bhushan had tweeted. It had come up for a lot of scrutiny. And ultimately, you know how that ended. A 1 rupee fine was imposed on him. Of course, he's gone on a review. I wouldn't like to really comment on this matter because it's still sub judice in a sense. That review is still pending. And that's something that I'd leave for the courts to ultimately decide. But then there was another case after that of stand-up comedian Kunal Kamra, who made certain controversial tweets, one on the Supreme Court swathed in saffron with a BJP flag. He even put a picture of a finger. He said middle finger depicting, a judge. Then he made snide remarks, references to Arnab Goswami's tale. Then he compared a judge to an aircraft cabin crew serving business class passengers champagne and all that. Now, that must be seen against this background. Kunal Kamra has, to date, I just checked before this lecture, 1.9 million followers on Twitter. How many? 1.9 billion followers on Twitter. That is several times more than the circulation of a newspaper. Most newspapers will have about 3 or 4 lakhs readers. 1.9 billion followers. So he may be a stand-up comedian, but he's got a tremendous sphere of influence in the public space, the public mind space. Now, Kunal Kamra refused to back down when there was a contempt notice filed, contempt complaint filed. The Attorney General, Mr. K.K. Venugopal, gave consent to try him under the contempt law. Kamra actually filed an 11-page affidavit, which was again widely headlined in the media. The headline was "Incarcerated Artists and Flourishing Laptops." In fact, he takes a swipe at the judiciary. He also takes a swipe at the mainstream media. Yes, it was seen as combative, even to the point of being irreverential and sarcastic. I'm going to read certain portions from his affidavit. The suggestion, Kunal Kamra writes in his affidavit, suggestion that my tweets could shake the foundation of the most powerful court in the world is an overestimation of my abilities. Just as the Supreme Court values the faith that the public places in it and seeks to protect it by the exercise of its contempt jurisdiction, it should also trust the public not to form its opinions of the court on the basis of a few jokes on Twitter. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as a lawyer, as an officer of the court, I do not subscribe to, I do not like unfair and derogatory comments on our judiciary. Let me be very clear about that. I do not take that lying down. I think there's a certain semblance of respect that we need to give institutions. It's not just judges in their personal capacity, but judges representing the judiciary, which we all represent, as I said, as officers of the court. Yes, the judiciary does have its flaws. It does have its weaknesses, like every other institution. But it reminds me of what Jesus Christ once told a crowd of protesters who were about to lynch a lady. He said, "He who has not sinned, pick up the first stone. He who has not sinned, pick up the first stone." I am proud to belong to the legal profession, but at the same time, I also recognize the need for reforms. And the contempt law, I feel, needs to keep up with the times. The contempt law definitely needs certain reforms, certain tweaking. Lord Denning had equipped. I have great respect and great admiration for Lord Denning, who had equipped. Let me say at once that we will never use this jurisdiction, he meant contempt jurisdiction, as a means to uphold our own dignity. That must rest on surer foundations. Nor will we use it to suppress those who speak against us. We do not fear criticism, nor do we resent it. Exposed as we are to the winds of criticism, nothing which is said by this person or that, nothing which is written by this pen or that, will deter us from doing what we believe is right. So I was wondering when I was going through Lord Denning's work, when he spoke about resting on surer foundations, whether he sounded like Kunal Kamra to some extent, to a limited extent. Finally, I for one believe that an estate of democracy that is meant to uphold the fundamental rights of citizens can be strengthened by criticism. An estate of democracy can also rise above criticism. But what exactly is criticism? A lot of people make this fundamental error here. They think that abuse is dissent and scurrilous allegations and attacks are criticism. That is not criticism. I don't think the judiciary would fight shy of genuine constructive criticism. But scurrilous allegations, personal attacks, vulgar commentary, I don't think showing a middle finger to the Chief Justice of India can be anything but vulgar. I do not stand for that at all. I mean, it's not a question of coming up with intelligent prose later on. That is something that we cannot stand for. Yes, you have a right to criticize judgments. You have the right to criticize the functioning of the courts, but you cannot demean an estate of democracy in that manner. You may disagree with anyone, but there's a way of disagreeing. You can disagree without being disagreeable. Finally, I'd like to leave you with my personal take that a contempt law does need tweaking, but I believe as we stand today with the social media in full flow that it is a necessary deterrent. Free speech, oh yes. Free for all, no.